diagram shows the stages of plot, and we can encounter this from, we have been given this, the stages of plot by a German novelist and playwright. Now, let us look at the stages of plot. Sorry. Let us look at the first stage of a plot, which is the exposition. This is the beginning section of the plot in which the necessary background information is provided. Characters are introduced, conflicts are introduced. Sometimes quite a number of characters are introduced, and other times between the exposition and the rising action, you have more characters and conflicts that are introduced. For example, in the government inspector, we are introduced to Klestikov or Helestikov and his decision to become an imposter. So right in the beginning, we have Helestikov introduced and how he comes to the decision of becoming the government inspector or acting like a government inspector. From the exposition, we have the rising action. And in the rising action, we look at the existing equilibrium before the conflict. And then a conflict is introduced, or more than one is introduced, breaking that stability of the story in the beginning. So characters are introduced, more characters are introduced, and more conflicts are introduced. If the main conflict of the story is not given in the exposition, the author may have wanted to leave it a bit, take a bit of time, and introduce it somewhere in the rising action. For example, in this case, the government inspector introduces different characters and conflicts. Anna and Maria, mother and daughter, wife to the mayor, and the conflicts that they face there in the story. Thereafter, we go to the climax, also known as the crisis. At this turning point, the plot reaches its point of greatest emotional intensity. Everything comes to an explosion. All the conflicts, the buildup comes to an explosion. And we learn the fate of the main characters. For example, the climax in the government inspector occurs when the postmaster bursts into the house and exposes the fact that the government inspector is not who all the government officials thought he was. Then we come to the falling action. So after the conflicts in the rising action, or let's say even from the exposition, the conflicts, the introduction of the characters, the build-up of the conflicts, and then they get to the crisis, an explosion of everything that has culminated. After the crisis, this tension now subsides, and it's now pushed towards the conclusion of the story. But before we get to the conclusion, we have a falling action. This is where the main conflict of the story, any loose ends are tied up. Whatever conflict that the protagonist and the antagonist shared, at this point, there must be revelation, there must be a resolution. For example, in the government inspector, after the postmaster reveals that Telestikov may be an imposter, the government officials begin to blame each other. Who did what and who allowed this? Then we come to the resolution, also known as a conclusion or the denouement. In this stage, all the conflicts, if there's any conflict, any disagreement, any problem that hasn't been solved, at this point, there must be now a closing. So this can be done through forgiveness. Characters forgive each other for wrongdoing. There could be a death of a character in order to solve whatever conflict, either a main conflict or a minor conflict. For example, again, in the government inspector, we have the gendarme enters and announces the arrival of the official from St. Petersburg. Now this leaves the government officials in shock, okay, because they realized the government inspector who they thought was the government inspector, Elestikov, is not it. But with this news, now they are shocked. They need to go and meet the real government inspector. Now, we talked about elements of plot. We talked about the plot itself. I mean, elements of the story, sorry. We talked about the plot. Now we also need to talk about the conflicts. Remember, I mentioned from the exposition to the rising action, before the climax, we have introduction of characters and conflicts, and they build up to the crisis. Now, let's look at the conflicts. What type of conflicts do characters encounter, and what is a conflict? So we will use this definition. A conflict is a struggle or encounter within the plot of the opposing forces that create an interest in the reader or audience. So in a story, as we said, we expect conflicts between the exposition and the climax. For example, in the government inspector, Helestikov's true identity as he's introduced and makes that decision, that becomes a conflict. Now, the question we have all throughout the story until he disappears from the stage or from the story, we keep on asking, will his true identity become clear to the mayor or the other civil servants? So we talked about conflict being a struggle between two opposing forces. Now let's look at the type of struggles that characters go through. The first one, we have character versus character. A character faces a problem caused by another character. So between people, between a person and an animal, so character versus character. Examples, Wiza versus Yona for the love of Everilda during the Jets fair. Another example, Wayaki versus the society for his love for Nyambura, the uncircumcised girl. In the river between, Medza versus his father in being told he should marry Edima because he failed in school. He didn't manage to finish and he came back home. So that's a conflict he has with his father. From character to character, we look for another type of conflict. Here we have character versus a force of nature. The force of nature could be weather, famine, even a supernatural force. For example, the boys versus the beast in The Lord of the Flies. Now, in The Lord of the Flies, the beast takes on three different forms. The first form is a snake thing. The boys believed that the beast was a snake type of thing. And later they discovered the body of a man who had parachuted and he was stuck in the trees. And then the end, well, I think I'll leave that up to you. Then we come to character versus self. Character versus self. Characters usually undergo a struggle in making a decision about a certain situation that they're in. For example, Wiza versus self. He had to decide, make a decision whether he should return home and face his father after having been expelled from school. But then he decided he couldn't do that, and he decided to go to Lusaka and find a way to fend for himself as he waited for his brother Kocha to come back. The second example, Medza versus himself, as he realizes that after his mission, he can't fit into his homeland. He can't go back to his father's house and fit in because he had undergone so much change and did not agree with some of the rules and beliefs of his father. So he decides to leave along with his cousin, Zambo. In the third example, you have Nyambura versus herself. She decides not to get circumcised in order to be considered a woman in her society. And that is because she had seen her own sister, Utoni, die from an infection after circumcision. So these are the conflicts that characters go through, but you may find through different literatures, they break them down even further to specify what type of characters, or if it's decision making, what types of decisions that characters go through. Now we come to the next element of a story, which is character. What is character? A character in a literary piece of work can be a person, an animal, or a thing that performs actions and dialogue in the development of the plot of a story. Characterization is therefore a process by which the author creates, develops, and presents a character to the reader. So he does this through, like we said, the actions and the dialogue. Let us go to the next part. We see just how this developmental process takes place. So the author will look at the following. The author looks at what a character says, what a character does, his actions, what people say about a character, and the physical appearance of the character. Now let's look at an example of this development. And we will use Quills of Desire by Sanyangwe. What a character says. When you read through the book, you will find Wiza talks about his dreams of earning degrees from prestigious universities, having a respected career, marrying the girl of his dreams. He constantly thinks about this and he verbalizes it. And this is his ambition. This is how we get to know what he's thinking. Then what about his actions? There's a point in the story where he stands up against bullying to protect his friend from the older boys. And those two boys become friends, his actions. There are other actions where we learn that he's temperamental, very short tempered. Now, apart from the actions and what the character says, let's go and see what other characters say about, let's use Riza. Continue with Riza from Quills of Desire. So some look at Wiza and say, oh, he's intelligent, while others think he's just troublesome. Remember, he's temperamental. Then we come to character's physical appearance. The book says Wiza is tall, intelligent, athletic, and a handsome young man in his prime. So he's an adolescent in secondary school.
Just unmute your mic, Monica.
All right, I go back. Okay, so I was
Characters.
saying, back to characters. All right, so we were talking about character development from Crows of Desire. We talked about what a character says, and we said Weezer verbalizes his ambition, his dreams of marrying the girl of his dreams, who's educated like he is going to be. He's going to be educated from very prestigious universities, earn different degrees, just like his brother. The second type is what the character's actions are. And I mentioned Wizard is temperamental. So at times he gets in trouble at school. So one time he stood up for his friend who was being bullied by the older boys. So that's what character says, the actions of a character. And now we look at what others say about the character. Some call Wizard intelligent, while others say he's a misfit. They can't understand him, and this makes him rather odd in school. Then we look at characters' physical appearance. So, what a character looks like is important, and the author will give details for us to have a visual picture of this character. So, the author says Wiza is a tall, intelligent, athletic, and a handsome young man in his prime. Now, after characterization, the process of characterization, defining what a character is, let's look at the types of characters. Oftentimes, you get learners ask you whether they're like personalities. They're close, but we're trying to see what type of characters we encounter in the story because these type of characters play a role in the development of the story. So the types of characters we have are protagonist, antagonist, round, flat, static, and dynamic. Now we will look at the first two types of protagonist and antagonist. A protagonist is a main or major character, while the antagonist is a character whom the protagonist struggles. So the good guy and the bad guy, or the good guy and the villain. Examples, we have the following: Wiza versus Jonah Sambukeni. I'd mentioned this. The two had a conflict in the story, and they're always in a struggle until that problem is resolved when Wiza leaves school. The second one, the protagonist is Kolestikov in the government inspector. And he is also an antagonist at the same time. This one is interesting. Then the next one is Ezeulu in the protagonist, with Nwaka being the antagonist in the Arrow of God. Then the last one is the protagonist, Wayaki, and the antagonist, Joshua, Kabonyi, and the rest of society in the river between. Now, we said literary devices, also called literary terms. We find in literature that some authors will use techniques and elements. Now, so far we've seen when we say elements of a story, we're talking about a narrative story. And remember, narrative stories can take the form of novels, can take the form of plays, and even a poem. like Song of Lawino. So we consider those elements that we need to make a story. Now let's look at techniques that can be used in story. So we look at the diction, the language that the author uses in a literary work. As you analyze a literary work, this is a very important part. And just from the beginning, when you start reading a text, you will discover and notice certain things. So formal language is one that we look at. What type of language is the author using? Is the author using with the characters? How do they think? Do they think in English? And if they do, at what level? If they think in their mother tongue, we'll get a translation, but we'll still get to see the thinking process and at what level the author thinks. I mean the character, sorry, thinks. Is this character educated? Does he use a wide range of vocabulary in writing and in speaking? Does he avoid colloquial English and slang? So when we look at Mission to Kala and we look for formal diction, from the beginning of the book, we are introduced to language that shows that the author is educated, but also the characters, Medza himself. Now, formal language, we said it avoids colloquial, slang, such expressions, but this can indicate whether a character is highly educated, sometimes emotionally detached, or even show a sort of pompous attitude. With Medza, this is interesting because when you read what he says or he's thinking, in this case, he was talking about going on a mission to Kala, and he was thinking, are my brethren, my people going to go with me, or am I going to go alone? And the example says, rather as Menelaus had conceived the rash notion of going off to the Troad to rescue Helen on his own. So he's thinking about Menelaus, he's thinking about Greek mythology. That is not everyday language. That is someone who has been exposed to a certain level of education to know about this and to use such an allusion. Then we look at, from formal English, we look at informal language, sorry. And with this diction, we look at using everyday language, colloquial expressions, slang, at times even obscenities with the characters. Let us look at the example we have. So a type of character that uses informal diction can signify one who's not very educated, may be crude if using obscenities. So the example we have is from Mission to Kala again, and this is Duckfoot Johnny, one of Medza's friends that he meets in Kala. And Duckfoot Johnny, of course, he's intoxicated at this point, and he's talking to Medza, and he says, what I think is, compared to me, you're like God Almighty. Sew, me, say, my old man was right, you know? So this is a sign. Yes, you could say it's slurred speech because he's drunk, but we are told that Duckfoot Johnny is not very educated. But because he's in the midst of Medza, so he's trying to speak like Medza. But we're given what type of character he is. So this is diction. Now, diction is one of the techniques. Another technique is the use of proverbs. We encounter these, and remember, these techniques help the author, the writer, improve their work, but also give it a flair. So proverbs are defined as a witty saying that states a general truth or a piece of advice. For example, Mr. Chambuleni says, that's Wiza's father. He says, "My son, life is like a queue. With patience, your turn always comes. When that time comes, you are free to pick what pleases you." And he used Proverbs in order to advise Wiza about life. From Proverbs, we have another technique, which is called a flashback. In a flashback, the writer brings something from the past into the present, usually information, in order for the reader to understand the present situation. The author must give that background information, and he can do so, or she can do so, through a flashback. For example, Wiza remembers meeting Everilda at a function where he had attended with his brother, as he tries to recall who this beautiful eighth wonder of the world is. Then we have foreshadowing. Foreshadowing is a technique used in order to warn or indicate what is to come for the characters in the story. So, for example, the mayor worries that those, excuse my language, shopkeepers are already cooking up petitions against me on the sly. Now, it is true they were, because they wanted to complain to Lestakov, but this is a sign of what was to come. Then, the river between, we have the example. Chege sees what happened to Muthoni, Muthoni, Nyambura's sister, as a warning to the hills. She decided to be circumcised, but unfortunately she died due to an infection. But this was a foreshadowing. And remember, Chege was a seer in the story. Let us look at the next technique, which is the symbol. What is a symbol? A symbol can be a person, an object, or idea that stands for something else in a literary work. So, for example, from The Lord of the Flies, we have the beast. This is a persuasive symbol of fear and evil that takes different forms. Remember, I had said the beast took the form of a snake thing, and then it again changed to be a man who had parachuted but had died in the trees, stuck in the trees. And from there, it took on another form, which was the boys themselves. So this was symbolic, and this was something that put fear in them until they, at the end, when they realized that the fear is actually within themselves and it is themselves, showing the human capacity to be evil. Medza in Mission to Kala is a symbol of civilization and a reservoir of knowledge for the people in Kala, since he's educated and everyone knows that he's an educated man and wants him to be part of their family and community. What other techniques can we look at? Figurative language. Now, when we think about figurative language, I know you're thinking of personification, metaphor, such, and we see those in poems, and that is right. That's where we look at the figures of speech. But keep in mind, figurative language can also be used in a narrative or prose. So, what are figures of speech? These are literary devices used to communicate messages figuratively. The use of figures of speech is also known, as I said, figurative language. Now, the first type is a simile. A simile compares two different objects by using the words like or as. For example, his smile is as bright as the sun. So comparing the smile to the brightness of the sun. Number two, they look after you. They look after your neck. The beads to wear around it are as easy to find as the droppings of a chicken. Yes, this was a proverb that Chambuleni told his son Wiza, but it is also comparing two different objects. Then we go to the next one, like a shepherd speaking to his flock. So here in the river between, we're comparing a shepherd. Now this takes us back to biblical teaching. Jesus was a shepherd. So Wayaki was seen as a shepherd for his people. So comparing the way Wayaki is seen and the way Jesus was seen or is seen in the Bible. Another example is since I took charge, the patients have been recovering like flies from the government inspector. And this was the official in charge of the hospitals. So the patients and flies. But this had to do with the care of the patients. Though ironical because they did not recover, they would die. And the second example, the next example, the world is like a mask dancing. If you want to see it well, you do not stand in one place from the arrow of God. This had to do with the conflict that Equeme, sorry, Eque, Eque, sorry, um, and Nwaka had with the white man. They had a conflict with the white man, and um, they were talking about sending one of them, one of their brothers, to go and be with the white men so that they can learn from the white settlers, from the white men, how to live with the white men in their community. And the next example is sleep enveloped him like the swathing mirages that were wrestling with the brilliance of the lagoon from the Lord of the flies. Again, like sleep, liken it to mirages. Another example from Kongi's Harvest. What? This is by Dan Lola. These trimmings may serve a wayside lunatic, but my friend, we must meet the leader as a conquering hero, not welcome him like some kona in-law. So Dan Lola is talking about how he should dress as the king going to meet Kongi. He can't just wear any garments, but he had to wear shiny, flamboyant. So comparing what he would wear or what he's wearing to what he should wear. The next one, her lips are like glowing charcoal from the Song of Lawino. And here we're talking about uh, Lawino, who was lamenting how African women try to be like white women and put makeup and lipstick. So the red in the lipstick is what is glowing, okay, on the lips. Then we have, oh, speak again, the bright angel, for thou art as glorious to this night, being o'er my head, as is a winged messenger of heaven. So Romeo and Juliet, Romeo is talking about Juliet and likening her to a celestial being and the brightness that she gives to his life. Thereafter, we have the metaphor. What is a metaphor? It is a figure of speech in which two unlike objects are compared without the use of like or as. For example, she is a goddess. The beauty that she has to a goddess. Tina dusts powder on her face, and it looks so pale. She looks like a wizard getting ready for a night dance. From the Song of Lowino. Tina is Clementina, the girlfriend to Oko, Lawino's husband. So she's talking about, again, how she tries to make herself up, but because of putting the powder is white, so she looks opposite of what she should look like. Then another metaphor is this precious book of love, this unbound lover. To beauty, to beautify him only lacks a cover. Again, from Romeo and Juliet, talking about Juliet's suitor who was supposed to marry her, and the mother was for that suitor, saying, he is perfect. He only needs you as a cover, someone to add on to what he is. Then the next one, he was a shrimp of a boy, about 6 years old, and one side of his face was blotted out by a mulberry colored birthmark. And this is talking about one of the boys who was younger, but also very small. So likening his stature or his body type to a shrimp, kind of small and slim or thin. The next one is in other towns, if I may say so. Mayors and other officials are more concerned with feathering their own interests. And this is the mayor trying to show that he's a caring mayor in his town, unlike other mayors. So he's comparing how he takes care of his people and how other mayors are only after their own nests or interests. And then the other metaphors we have, you call this wrestling? No, my clansmen, we have not wrestled. We have merely studied each other's hand. Remember, I said a conflict with the white man and the arrow of God? And the two men are talking about, this was talking about the different views that they had after pinning the white man to the ground. Then we have the moon was also awake. Her gaze was hard and looked brittle. This is from the river between. And here we're likening the moon being awake and her gaze. I think, let me just make a correction. On the last metaphor that I gave, I think this is more of a personification because under personification, this technique, we give inanimate objects human qualities and attributes. So the moon does not gaze. It doesn't act like a human being. Other examples of personification, the earth has swallowed all my hopes, but she's the hopeful lady of my earth. And here Lord Capulet was talking about Juliet, his only surviving child, because all his other children died. And that's why he said the earth swallowed up all my hopes. Then the next example, the whole town seems dead. It is not dead. It's probably not exciting, as one of the ladies in the mayor's house wanted it to be. Then another example of personification, the great rock loitered, poised on one toe, decided not to return, moved through the air, fell, struck, turned over, leapt drowning through the air and smashed a deep hole in the canopy of the forest. This is from the Lord of the Flies, sorry. And when we talk about the rock is still, doesn't move, but we're giving it the human qualities of moving, poised on one toe like a ballerina. So we can have that visual effect. And the next one, yet the hopes and desires kept haunting him. They had followed him all life. So talking about um, hope, sorry, desires that do not hunt people. They just have desires, but giving them human qualities. Now we'll look at the other technique of imagery, or the figure of speech of imagery. Now, imagery is important because it helps us visualize what the story is, a situation, a character. So it's important to add details to describe people and places. And that is why imagery is defined as language that produces pictures in the minds of people who are reading or listening. So below we have a picture of the Victoria Falls. So where you are, I'm sure you're coming up with different adjectives to describe this beautiful place. And if you've been there, what it made you feel and what it made you think. I believe others have even come to Christ because of looking at the Victoria Falls and how mighty it is from top and going to the bottom. Then we look at the hyperbole, an exaggeration of ideas for the sake of emphasis. For example, I know all the chickens, trees, and dogs in the village, meaning I know the village very well. I am mad about good food. It's an exaggeration. You can't be mad about good food, but he's trying to say, I enjoy eating. And that was holistical. Hyperbole, sorry. Hyperbole, another example we have is Clementine's body resembles the ugly coat of the hyena. She resembles a wild cat that has dipped its mouth in blood. Again, remember, this is the girlfriend to Lawino's husband, so she's not going to be kind since she is one of the reasons why Oko doesn't hug or hold her hand anymore. So she's trying to exaggerate, but at the same time communicate how she feels about this other woman. In conclusion, there are so many literary terms at our disposal. These are just a few of what I've gone through. And as we interpret, analyze, identify these techniques, these elements, these literary terms, as we read the text to our learners or read with our learners, it's important to introduce them, but also probably wait until they encounter them. Some of them, they will encounter them in reading, and that will be an opportunity for us to give an explanation because they will ask. But all in all, as teachers, this is just some of them, and there's so many more that we can use. Now, literary terminologies. Remember, they're a collection of common structures used in literature, and different writers use them in different genres. In the beginning, I said novels, plays, and drama, uh, poetry, sorry. And the use of these terminologies allows readers to recognize, compare, and most of all, appreciate the different texts that they encounter of different genres. And lastly, as you prepare to teach literary terms to a literature in English class, remember to include examples of the text or from the text that they're going to encounter, as well as even from popular culture. Use what they know and then go to the unknown. We now come to the end of my presentation. Thank you very much. Over to you, Mr. George.
Thank you, Madam Monica, for the wonderful presentation. And thank you for to the audience for being there. At this moment, we are going to invite if there are any questions or comments, you can use the raise your hand button, or you can use the chat box, whichever is okay for you. Please indicate so if you have a question or you want to make a contribution. Any questions or contributions? Any contributions? I cannot see a hand, neither can I see any message. Oh, people have, okay, there is, all right. Mr. Peter Chilawa, I've seen your hand. You can unmute yourself, sir, and go ahead with your question or contribution.
Good evening, fellow teachers of languages. From actually the evidence that we have that people are not unable to raise their hands, it means that the presentation was very excellent. I must commend Madam Imasiku for that. Maybe mine might not be a comment per se. I would love to ask if at all there is a platform where we can get the material that has been presented on this day. Thank you.
Thank you for that, Mr. Chilawa. We will communicate through this. I think we saw some emails, so we'll be able to email you the presentations as we go on. Okay. Any other question or contribution? I know some people came in a little bit late. It could be network problems and have found us where the presentation is actually at the end. But if you still have something to inquire, you can go ahead. You can use the raise your hand feature or simply write something in the chat box. Are we able to see the chat box? All right. So according to what I'm able to see, there is nothing. Okay, so if you would like to give us a comment on how the presentation went, you can use the email that we used to invite you to the meeting. We can give feedback to our presenters. So next week, same time, we'll be looking at, should be composition writing with the Chief Lazaro Sinkara. Let's prepare for that. And we look forward to seeing more of you. Let's invite our friends. We'll share the link. Actually, the link doesn't change. We'll use the same link as this one. Just hold on a second. I see a message down there. There's something in the chat box. Okay, thank you so much for the presentation. I must say it was so practical. Thank you for that. That's just a commendation. Okay, Madam Monica, I can't thank you enough for this splendid presentation. So as we said, we'll share it with our colleagues via email. Let's meet again next week, same time. Thank you so much. Bye-bye from me, and see you next week.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.